My grandparents had passed away within a few months of each other, leaving their house empty. There was talk of renting it out initially, but because of its poor state of disrepair, the family decided against it. No consensus about what to do with it could be arrived at, therefore it would be left to decay for another decade or more before I would stumble upon it. My aunt and I were going through my mother's things and discovered an old family photo album. Mom had gone off on one of her journeys and no one was sure if she'd ever return. Her and I had been having an on and off relationship for years, so there was a lot about the family I didn't know. I came across a picture of her and I when I was just a baby, but I didn't recognize the house we were standing in front of. I inquired, and my aunt told me about the old Wheeler family house that had once belonged to her parents. No one had been there in over a decade, and she wasn't even sure if it was still standing. So, after half an hour of badgering, she agreed to take me out to see it. That following morning, we headed out of town through 30 miles of cornfields until we came to a turnoff that led down a long, weedy gravel road. As we crested the hill, I was taken aback. The house I saw before me, despite being run down, was still breathtaking. In its prime, it must have been the finest home in the county. My aunt pulled up within a few yards of it and we got out. From what I could see, nobody but the occasional mowing company had been there in a very long time. I couldn't help but be in awe of the place. The vibrant pink and blue paint had long faded from its soaring towers, and the massive porch was beginning to sag in a few places. Before I entered, I wanted to take in every bit of the wonderful facade as I could. Around the back was the remnants of the old horseshoe pit and, what I was told, my grandfather's Ford pickup. Although the big house had long seen its best days, I knew I hadn't seen anything that could have compared. Maybe one of those beautiful Victorian mansions in San Francisco. Even those would be dwarfed in comparison to this. When I was ready, we climbed the concrete steps and entered through the back entrance. From the moment we cracked the door, we were overwhelmed by a hideous smell coming from inside. We assumed it was a normal part of having a house sealed for so long and continued with our search. Everything appeared as if it had been left where it was on my grandmother's last day, almost like a time capsule or museum. The lights were even still working. Only later did I discover that my mother had been paying the bills all these years in hopes someone would return and live there someday. Walking from room to room and seeing all the beautiful antique furnishings, I couldn't stop wondering why I had never been told about the house. Regardless of our frequent estrangements, I would have helped my mother with the upkeep of it. It was downright insane to me to leave such a beautiful place to rot. Then again, my mother's strange ways were the main reason for our frequent falling outs. As we made our way to the second floor, the smell only got worse. I suggested we cut our visit short and just take a quick look around. Every door was closed, so I went for the closest one and stuck my head in. This must have been a guest room or spare. Upon the bed laid a beautiful and elaborate quilt easily over 100 years old. My aunt was going through a cedar chest in a room next to me. I joined her and we discovered another much older photo album and decided to bring back with us to look at later. She closed the door behind us and I made my way toward the last room. Unfortunately, the closer I got to the door, the stronger the smell got. I was reluctant to open it, but I thought if the poor critter was where I could get to it, I'd take it outside and give it a good burial. Cracking the door, the stench slapped me in the face, and I lost focus for a moment. When I regained my composure, I was met with a terrible sight. Before me was not a dead forest creature, but a human being. The bloated body, now unrecognizable, laid curled up silently on the bed. I could feel my knees begin to buckle, so I turned as quickly as possible away and out of the room. My aunt was confused by my behavior and stuck her head in before yanking it out, quickly again. We both ran down the stairs where the smell was less potent, and I called 911. The officers spent a few minutes in the room before coming back out with a small piece of paper and a driver's license. One of them joined us at the table where we were sitting and asked a few questions about my mother. This made me nervous, and I began demanding he explain himself. A serious look came across his face, and he told us that the body appeared fact belonged to my mom. I didn't want to believe it at first, but when he handed me her license, I knew it was true. My aunt and I held each other for a long time and cried. The officer gave us a few moments before interjecting himself again. Then he asked me if I knew why she would take her own life. I had naturally assumed my mom had died in her sleep. She was an older woman, but the note he handed me made everything clear. She had been depressed for a long time because of being at odds with each other, and the last time we spoke, some things were said and she feared she couldn't take it back. The morning after our argument, she decided to return to the only place that she'd ever been happy. Although she claimed to not be sure of what she was going to do at the time, the poor state of the house just sent her over the edge. The last sentence asked that I not blame myself for her death and that I move on with my life. The ending read simply, "Goodbye, Mom." A couple of weeks later, after everyone had time to deal with their grief, I brought the remaining family members together. After seeing the old house and realizing how the poor condition of it hurt my mother, I proposed we try to raise the money to renovate it. In light of what had just occurred, I wanted to at least try to create something positive from our tragedy. I was given their blessings and went to work. It took some time, but on the first day of spring 2018, the Historical Society allowed me to lead the first tour of the newly restored Wheeler Mansion. A great day could have been much better had my mother been there with me. No matter our differences, it was her who inspired me and the one who truly made it all possible. For the hunting season of 2017, I got in on a lease with a guy from work. I didn't have time to check the area out before the season started, so the inevitable occurred and I got lost my first day. That morning I left the camp just before dawn. I'm not the kind that hunts from a stand. I'm your traditional stalk and shoot type of hunter. Since I wasn't familiar with the lease and I stupidly left my GPS back at the camp, I had to stick to the main paths in order to not get lost. Most of the morning I did well. However, as I grew tired, I lost focus and veered from the trail. In my defense, I came across this really fresh set of tracks. Of course, I had to follow them. The sucky thing was that they continued on to a neighboring property and I had to stop following them. When I looked up, I realized I was way off the trail and didn't know how to get back. The rest of the day was spent trying to find my way back to camp. About an hour before dark, I noticed a rundown house and cabin in the distance. By now, I wasn't sure whose property I was on. I hoped that if somebody was living there, they could help me, but as I got closer, I could tell the place had been abandoned for a good while. I knocked to make sure, but with no reply, I made myself at home. My first goal was to get a fire going. After I did that, I began combing through the cabinets for food and other things I thought could help me. Not much but a questionable can of chili and some candles were found. I heated up the chili over the fire and combined it with a half-eaten bag of chips. After dinner, I looked through the bedroom and discovered an old map of the area. I wasn't sure how accurate it would be after all that time, but I was happy to find it. I spread it out on the floor in front of the fireplace and planned my course for the morning. I was shocked to see that I had veered over 5 miles from where I'd started. At some point, I must have dozed off. During the night, I had a super vivid dream that a man was sitting in the chair next to me and just staring. He never said a word. And when I jerked awake and saw that I was alone, I was relieved and quickly fell back asleep. The following morning, I woke up at 6:15 and got my stuff together. I made sure the fire was completely put out and headed back to camp. I just stepped from the house when I came face to face with a strange man. The guy from my dream, in fact. I was confused at first, and when he spoke, I knew my dream had really happened. This man was holding an old Marlin 30-30, not an odd sight for a hunter during deer season. This dude didn't look like a hunter, though. He wore an old, dirty backpack and normal, bright, yet dingy street clothes. His eyes had a very crazed look to them that made me uncomfortable to gaze at. I was surprised, but regained my calm and said, "Good morning." Instead of saying it back, he just stared at me with those crazed black eyes. I began to say something, but he interrupted and asked what I was doing in the cabin. Before I could answer, he blurted out that it was his place. I continued and explained what had happened the day before. The entire time I was telling him this, he was gripping the rifle so tightly his knuckles were beginning to turn white. His behavior was beginning to scare me. The only thing I wanted to do was get back to camp and then home. The last word had barely left my lips before he angrily told me that it was his place. It appeared to have been empty for quite a while, but I wasn't going to argue with him. I apologized as quickly as I could and went on my way. For a good 100 yards or more, I kept looking behind me. I was waiting to get shot in the back. Every time I looked back, he was staring maniacally back at me and death gripping his gun. It took a couple of hours to find my way back, but by then, I'd had plenty of time to dwell upon our encounter, and I was truly freaked out by then. It actually hit me. The guys that were still in camp were happy to see me and asked what had happened. I just said I got lost and camped out for the night, never mentioning the nutcase that I met. I doubt that they take it seriously anyhow. The whole experience had me so scared I wanted nothing more than get home. The other guys must have thought I was crazy. After throwing all my stuff into the back of my truck, I tore off out of there and never returned. I knew I'd never be able to feel safe knowing that kook was somewhere out in the woods, possibly watching our party. That following Monday, my friend asked what had caused me to leave so abruptly. I made up some lie about my wife being sick. I'm not sure if he even believed it. Nothing was said about it again, and maybe, just maybe, things are better that way. There was the empty house on my street that all the kids thought was haunted. I'm not sure how long it had been there, but I'm almost positive no one had lived there during my lifetime. The style in which it was made differed drastically from the other houses around it, so I think it might have been built far earlier than the others. The talk among the grown-ups was that it belonged to the guy who built the housing addition, and when he lost all of his money, he shot himself in the study. After his death, his estate got stuck in probate, so the house sat empty. I haven't found anything supporting the story, but it went a long way to reinforcing the haunted mansion idea. I spoke to an older kid who had been inside it before, and he claimed there were satanic stars painted everywhere. I now know he was BSing me, but as a 7-year-old, that scared the life out of me. There was a big field between that house and the rest where we used to play. Once or twice, a kid would hit a ball into the yard and have to go get it. It was funny to watch them try to hop over the wrought iron fence and back as fast as they could. They almost always tripped coming back over. Then one day, it was my turn, and now I wasn't laughing. A group of us kids had been playing football all afternoon. The team I was on had just scored a touchdown, and I was chosen to kick the field goal. We had this old metal structure that we used to kick through. It was stuck off in the corner of the field, and we had to drag it out to use it. My team set it up about 20 yards from the old house. It was obviously too close, but kids don't always think things through before they do them. The kid playing center hiked the ball to our QB, and I nailed it straight between the bars and on through one of the upstairs windows. I watched helplessly on as it happened, knowing I couldn't stop it. The second it came into contact with the glass, all the other kids took off. All except one, the kid who the ball belonged to. He'd just got it a few days before for a birthday present. He knew he was going to be in serious trouble if he didn't come home with it. He didn't have to say a word. Tears were already beginning to roll down his face. I suppose I could have told him to F off and led him to his doom, but that's not my nature. I assured him I would go get his ball back, but he had to go in with me. This made him far more scared. I'm sure inside his head he strongly considered leaving it where it was, but he knew he had no other choice. As he choked back the sobs, he nodded, and we made our way towards certain death in our minds. We entered around the back to prevent being seen by nosy neighbors. I tried the knob and was surprised to see it open. Fortunately, the lace curtains were light enough for us to see our way around. The scary graffiti was nowhere to be seen. Actually, the inside almost looked untouched, other than white sheets draped over the furnishings. Once I realized that it was nothing like I'd ever imagined, the old house lost much of its hold over me. My friend was younger, and it was obvious he was still terrified. I had begun looking around at all the old pictures, but he wanted to get out as quickly as possible. Several times he had to pull on my shirt to get me moving. The second floor was similar to the first, except for the terrible smell. All the rooms were open but the one at the end of the hall. We looked through the others until we came to the closed door. I opened the door and the smell got a lot worse, but I wasn't concerned about where it was coming from at the moment. Both of us pulled our shirts over our faces and rushed in to search. I was rummaging through the sheets and a shrill scream came from behind me. I spun around and saw my friend with his hand over his mouth, pointing at a man laying on the floor. We both stood still and waited for him to move. For a second, I thought we were in big trouble. However, the longer we stood there, it dawned on me. He was the source of the smell, and it was because he was dead. I lost my cool after that and yelled out, "He's dead. Let's get out of here." My friend was hot on my heels. We didn't stop until we reached my house. When we caught our breath, I realized we'd left the ball behind, and neither of us wanted to go back in, so after a long time we gave up and went to my parents and told them what we had found. They were cool about it. Actually, first they made sure we were okay, and then they called 911. And the two of us sat at my bedroom window and watched the police go in and out of the house. When the paramedics brought the man's body out, a police officer followed behind him with a football. He brought it over and talked to us for a while. We thanked him and he left. A couple of days later, there was a small paragraph in the paper talking about our morbid discovery. Us kids had been coming up with all kinds of horrible causes of death for the man. In the end, it turned out to be a run-of-the-mill drug overdose. Most of us quickly fell back into our normal lives and didn't talk about it unless it was brought up. My friend said his parents had asked him once if he had anything to do with the thing in the paper. Perhaps wisely, he played dumb and just let it go. To their dying day, I don't think they knew how close he came to losing that ball forever. I was too young to remember what the house originally looked like. My mom showed me pictures taken with the old couple standing out in front of it a few times. The husband passed away in early 1995 with no one left around to help her day to day. His wife, sadly, had to go off to a nursing home. By most accounts, they were a much-loved part of the neighborhood. With their loss, there seemed to come a rapid decline in its fortunes. The sell-offs were gradual at first. Before anyone caught on, almost 20% of the homeowners had moved on to greener pastures. Not all of those owners sold outright. A small group decided to hold on to their properties and rent or lease them out. This unfortunately began to attract tenants of a much lower income level. In a matter of a few short years, the neighborhood had sunk so low, only a handful of those original families from 30 years before were still around. Those that replaced them rarely stayed longer than 6 months at a time, and the damage they managed to do in that period was often things that couldn't be fixed with a little drywall and sod patches. I think I was around 13 or so when I began to notice how bad things were. It wasn't out of the ordinary to see open deals, and shootings had become a commonplace. The last few remaining original families were far from happy with the way things had turned out, but there wasn't much they could do. Most of them were older couples previously unfamiliar with any form of crime. Once the drug dealers moved into the old couple's house, the remaining law-abiding citizens feared for their futures. After the couple's deaths, the house was left to one of their children. They had rented it out for the first few years, but when the tenants destroyed it one too many times, they sold it off to a young family. The new owners took the time to renovate the house, only to put it back on the market within the year. They were good people and weren't prepared for the dangers ahead of them. The current homeowners are a largely properly invested company. They managed to rent it out once or twice, but at the time the dealers began squatting, it had been empty for over 2 years. Although most of the old families had moved on, there were still enough left to be angered by the dealers' actions. That old couple had been loved so much the very idea of drugs being dealt out of their home was sacrilegious. It was bad enough the neighborhood had been turned into an open-air drug market, but turning a house, especially that one, into a crack den was a step too far. At first, a few of the men on the street asked the gang to move somewhere else. Their pleas would fall on deaf ears and be answered with curse words and certain finger gestures. They would try calling the police, but by the time officers arrived, no one would be present. This strategy wouldn't do anything other than anger the squatters. They got their revenge one night when they caught Mr. Murphy, my friend's dad, with his guard down. He had gone out to put a letter in his mailbox and the dealers pounced on him. It was initially just a beatdown, but when he tried to fight back, he was pistol whipped almost to death. This ended up being the final straw. The gang wouldn't see what was coming, and after it was all over, they would cease to ever be a problem again. Me and my friends began to notice our parents acting extra strange, sneaking off to talk and going mum the second we approached them. Things went down a few weeks later. Early one morning at around 4 a.m., I was awakened by sirens and lights from across the street. When I rushed to the window, I got there just in time to see the roof of the dope house collapsing in flames. The fire department did their best, but the house was completely consumed by the time they arrived. I noticed my folks were already out front watching, which seemed odd. I joined them and the rest of the neighborhood on our lawns to take in the festivities. I don't remember there being a single person upset to see the house go. After the attack on Mr. Murphy, the house went from being a beautiful symbol of a greater time to a den for dangerous animals. The fire had burned itself out by dawn. That was when they began to bring out the bodies. 6 in total lost their lives in the fire. The smiles on many of the men's faces struck me as a little cold, but with all the trouble they'd had, I couldn't blame them for being a bit happy. I was still shocked to see what came next. The arson investigation began within days. The suspicion among most of us was that it was electrical or the result of a lit cigarette. It eventually turned out to be a blatant arson. The evidence showed several trails of accelerant around the outside of the house. A few investigators traveled around the neighborhood asking each owner if they had seen anything suspicious. No one had, or so they claimed. One incident still sticks with me today. I overheard my parents speaking to the investigator, and my father mentioned more than one attack upon the house by an opposing gang. The problem is, I don't recall the gang ever having trouble with anyone but the neighbors. I have since come to form my own opinions on the fire's cause. By the end of this month, the case was closed and ruled an arson attack from a competing drug gang. A demolition company came along right before Christmas and leveled the remaining structure, and that was in 2017, and the lot has been empty since then. The neighborhood, while not as good as it supposedly once was, is a happier place without the dealers. While the drug trade continues in the surrounding area, our neighborhood has remained rather quiet. As I grow older and think on starting my own family, I am of the opinion that the fire could be seen as a sign of better things to come. Maybe the way it was done shouldn't be so important. I was on my postal route one morning when I got the idea. A small part of my route cuts through this old abandoned neighborhood. At the end of the cul-de-sac sits the decrepit 2-story house, something like you'd seen in an old horror movie. This was where I was going to do it. You see, I have this friend, Philip. We are part of a ghost hunting group in our spare time. It's a pastime I really enjoy and derive a lot of excitement from. Philip, however, is terrified of anything supernatural. Something as average as a cheesy ghost video on YouTube scares the life out of him. I'll never understand why he puts himself through one of our investigations. I asked him once why he did it, and he said it was a way to face his fears, something he'd heard about on TV. This put the kernel of an idea in my head. When I saw the house, it grew into a full-blown plan. I was going to pull a joke on Philip. When it was over, hopefully his fear of spooky things would be defeated. Anytime I can get a good laugh and help a friend at the same time seemed like a win-win to me. I called him up that afternoon and told him we had a new house to investigate that Friday night. He sounded excited and I couldn't help but laugh, knowing what I had in mind for him. I had 2 days to get what I needed and set everything up. I'd stop in during my route and look for the best places to rig my equipment. There were signs of people, but from all I could see, they had not been around for a long time. Finally, Friday night came. After work, I parked my car a few streets over and walked to the house. I wasn't expecting Phil for another hour. I took this time to complete any last-minute tasks. I got done with 15 minutes to spare and crawled into my hiding place. Within minutes, I heard footsteps approaching outside. I bit my lip to stifle my giggling. I had never felt so much like a child at that moment. Mere seconds after I heard the footsteps, my phone vibrated with a text message. It was Philip. He said he was held up by a train near his apartment and was running late. This was bad news. Phil lived almost 30 minutes away. I'd have to lay crunched up in a hidey hole even longer. The steps entered the house, echoing down the massive hallway. Wait a minute. This is when it hit me. If Philip was a half hour away, who was here? Voices of at least 2 men came bouncing down the hall toward me. One man had noticed my equipment and sounded very angry. I heard loud bangs a few seconds later, from what I can assume was my stuff being smashed. The second man had a slight slur to his voice, and his words were far more aggressive. "If I find out who did this, I'm going to cut his head off and put it on a pole outside. Maybe that'll keep people out." My heart began to beat like it was trying to break loose from my body. I wasn't sure what they were capable of and hoped that they would leave without realizing I was still there. I did my best to not make any noise. I continued to listen and then heard something I dreaded. One of the men, the drunk one, found my bag. I had stuck it in a hole under the stairs to hide it. Even then, I wasn't sure that they knew I was still there, at least until the other man began calling for me to come out. He said if I made them look, they were going to make me sorry when they found me. All doubt was removed with that statement. I could hear them going from room to room, opening closets and doors. They were a few rooms away, and I decided I needed to get out of there that second. When I heard them enter the room next to me, I made a break for it. I didn't dare look back, and within seconds, I could hear footfalls behind me. So I pushed myself even harder, and it seemed to work. The closer I got to my car, the footfalls seemed to grow quieter. Still, even then, I didn't dare slow down. I ran around to the driver's side of the car and unlocked the door as fast as I could. This was the first look at my 2 pursuers. I was pleased to see them almost 100 yards behind me. They were gasping and fighting for every breath. I wasn't taking any chances, though. I started my car and tore out of there without looking back ever again. That was when I remembered Philip was on his way. I made up some quick BS text and sent it to him. I did so just in time. I was 4 or 5 blocks from the house when we met each other across the intersection. He pulled up to me and I began spinning some yarn about a wrong address, and he must have believed it. He shrugged his shoulders and turned around and headed for home. I followed him for about a mile just to make sure and then turned off for my own place. To my knowledge, Phil still has no idea how close he was to being assaulted by a pair of angry squatters. The same likely applies to the practical jokes I was planning. After my run-in with them, things got put into perspective. I realized the joke was a childish thing to do in the first place. I put stupid stuff like that behind me now. I'm in no position to tell folks how to live their lives. If he wants to live in fear, that's his choice. God knows there's plenty of things out there to be afraid of. This story may be too fantastic to believe, but I promise it happened. It was the last months of 1999 and my first marriage had just ended. When we began discussions, I agreed to let my ex continue to live in our house with the kids. As a result, I was thrust onto the market for a new home. For the time being, I was crashing in an extended stay hotel living on fast food. Finally, as that spring approached, I found a place I loved. The only disappointing part of the deal was that it had been uninhabited for going on 7 years. The woman that had lived there before had died, and her heirs had let it sit empty. It was eventually agreed upon to put it on the market, and that's when I came upon it. Despite the probable long list of repairs, the price was too good to pass up. The morning of March 3rd, I picked up the keys and signed the papers. The house was officially mine, and I got to work immediately to make it livable. I replaced a broken window and a few other things before I moved in 2 weeks later. I hadn't been there 2 days before I received a visit from a pair of detectives. They sat me down and told me the craziest thing I'd ever heard in my life. According to them, the nice little old lady who had lived there, Sharon, had an abusive husband named Walter. She claimed Walter left for the store one morning and never returned. Because of his history of abuse, she didn't report his disappearance. The couple's only child, Melinda, didn't either. Her mother had told her Walter had been having an affair with a woman from his job and had likely ran away to be with her. Melinda took her mother's story at face value, and the woman bid Walter good riddance and moved on with their lives. Within the year, Sharon, now a free woman, began a relationship with her neighbor, Joseph Poole. She was granted a divorce, and the couple were married not long after. The pair lived out their lives in the house. Not everyone was so eager to believe Sharon's story, and the police were asked by Walter's sister to investigate his disappearance. And year after year, the trail always led back to Sharon, but the detectives on the case never had enough proof to arrest her. Then, about 15 years after he went missing, a new pair of detectives were put on the trail. They went back to Walter's sister, now a very old woman, and asked if she had any idea how Sharon could have disposed of her brother's body. For the first time since the case began, she recalled an incident that took place not long after Walter's disappearance. She was visiting Sharon, hoping to get information as to where her brother had moved to, and she happened to notice a large patch of the backyard where the ground had been tilled up and roses had been planted. This struck her as odd because it was still in the middle of winter and at least 4 months before planting season began. The bushes would surely die in the brutal Michigan winter. She asked Sharon about this, and she simply said she wanted to get ahead of things. The sister had no reason to disbelieve her at the time and accepted the story. For the first time in a long time, the police had a direction to follow. However, they were frustrated by the judge's denial of a search warrant, and the case soon ran out of steam, as it had so many times before. Life would proceed, and over the years, the case would be forgotten. That was until a new police chief was hired, and he launched an initiative to clear the city's open cases. My visitors were assigned the case. After a little research, they discovered Sharon and her new husband had died, and the house had a new owner. The reason for their visit was to ask if I would allow them to dig up the yard to look for Walter's remains. I was naturally shocked by all I'd heard and needed time to think about it. After taking a few days to consider the request, I gave them the okay. The following morning, 20 or so cops, accompanied by a backhoe, began their search. I want to say I was surprised by what they found, but after hearing their story, Walter's skeleton being discovered was almost expected. At the end of the day, everything seemed to work out for the best. The cops managed to close a 50-year-old mystery, and Walter got to be put away alongside his loved ones. The only downside was Walter's sister didn't live to see it. She deserved to be there for the funeral after all the time she had put in the search for him. The situation had made me do a lot of thinking since it was brought to my attention. From all reports, old Walter was not good to his wife or respected their marriage. Maybe Sharon had a good reason to put an end to his nonsense. The problem I have with what she did is that by killing Walter and hiding his body away in the garden, his innocent sister, who had hurt no one, was left with a terrible notion that she and the rest of his family had been abandoned by him for a young piece of tail. Then, as time carried on, and she had come to terms with the strong possibility her brother was dead, she had nowhere to go to mourn him. And that, to me, my friends, just doesn't feel right. No one knew where it came from. We all went to sleep the night before and it was there the next morning. Not even the owners of the house on both sides had a clue how it got there. Neither homeowner ever heard as much as the hiss of air brakes during the whole of that night. The only real indication of how it had arrived was the trailer it was sitting upon. I was still relatively young at the time, around 13, but the subject was a hot topic around the neighborhood, and every person I spoke to, whether a kid or an adult, was eager to talk about it. Our neighborhood was somewhat new and off by itself, and it wasn't out of the ordinary for folks to dump things out there. Dogs and cats were the most common, but 1 or 2 cars would turn up every year. A house, though, no one ever seen that, or expected it. The days passed, but no information could be gotten from anywhere. Soon it began to take on a spooky and haunted reputation. Along with its phantom-like arrival in the dark of the night, it did look a little similar to that house from Psycho. The stories first reached me while I was talking to a friend's younger brother. Among the grade school kids, the house was becoming a very real symbol of fear, although it was just an old, empty house to me. This fear didn't prevent some of the more adventurous of them from entering and exploring it. I witnessed a particularly funny episode just by chance. While loafing aimlessly around the streets, I was passing by in time to see a preteen boy running from the house in terror, claiming that something had grabbed him. Whether his imagination had gotten the best of him or an older kid was having a bit of fun, the horror put upon this abandoned house had fully taken root in the neighborhood. While all this was going on, a real boogeyman had been forgotten about. I'll not put his actual name here, not because of privacy, but that of his victims. We'll call him Rudy. Rudy had grown up in the neighborhood, and until he was arrested, was well liked, but a lot of the parents had voiced their fears early on because of his habit of hanging around younger boys. When he was released from jail, he was allowed to move in with his folks. Anyone who wasn't aware of his proclivities beforehand knew now. Every parent in the neighborhood watched him closely, but when the ghost house popped up, people's focuses shifted. A few of us teenagers were riding our bikes around the neighborhood. The father of a boy we'll call Bill was looking for a son. I overheard him speaking to a young kid close by, asking if he had seen him. Nonchalantly, the boy said that he had seen Bill going into that ghost house with Rudy just a few minutes prior, and this got my full attention. The shock of the father's face is still crystal clear in my mind. I turned around and watched the father run full speed into the house. Most of us there stood transfixed as we saw Bill's dad disappear inside. Things were quiet for about the first 30 seconds, then, all of a sudden, a loud ruckus broke out, followed by Rudy flying out of the doorway and onto the ground below. Bill's dad was close behind. He leapt onto Rudy, throwing fists as he landed. Bill came out a few seconds later crying for his dad to stop. His dad ignored him, standing up and kicking Rudy to the ground over and over. Rudy eventually got to his feet and ran for home. Bill and his dad were right behind him. I continued to watch until they disappeared from my sight. Bill and Rudy would both claim later on that nothing had happened between them. Either way, Bill's dad had the support of most of the community, and Rudy declined to press charges on him. Rudy would eventually move away and out of the minds of most of us until he was arrested 3 years later for abducting and killing 2 boys near his new home. Only then did we realize how lucky Bill had been. That night, as I'd fallen asleep, I remember wondering what was going to happen to Rudy and Bill's dad. When I woke up, things were normal for a summer morning. Around 9, I was making a bowl of cereal when I got a phone call. It was a friend of mine, and he was short of breath and excited. "The ghost house. It's gone, man." I hung up and hopped on my bike. When I arrived at the end of the street, I looked down and saw the empty lot as it used to be. I rode down to it, and a small group were gathered talking to the neighbors. It was much the same as the morning when it appeared. They hadn't heard or seen anything strange. It seemed to leave just as silently as it had arrived. To this day, I haven't met a soul who knows anything about that house. Sometimes I think I dreamt the whole thing up. But then I speak to an old friend from the neighborhood and my memories are confirmed. Of course, I don't believe it was haunted or anything like that, but I know for sure that something was wrong about it, and I pray that I never see it again. I should start off by saying my brother is not only a military man, but he's your basic hetero, never let them see you cry cliche of a military man. He's not afraid of anything. Well, except for the entire country of Japan. This is his story. My brother joined the Marines when he was 18 and was stationed in Japan. He really enjoyed his time there for a while, the girls specifically. He made friends with some of the Japanese guys his age who worked around the base. On nights where him and his soldier friends had the night off, the local Japanese guys would show them around, bring them to bars, introduce them to girls, etc. One night, after a little drinking and no luck with girls, the guy invited my brother home to play video games. My brother accepted the invite and they played video games for a few hours. During this time, he tells my brother the main reason he wanted to get home early was because his little sister had been suffering from night terrors, causing her to wake up screaming, crying, and sometimes vomiting. He was worried about her and wanted to be home in case she had an episode. At this point in the story, I should explain how this guy's house was shaped. The house was built in the shape of a horseshoe with a garden in the middle. His bedroom was at the very edge of one side of the U shape and his sister's all the way on the other end, so they are essentially across the garden from each other. If he looks out of his window, he can see into hers and vice versa. So anyways, they decide to call it a night, and the Japanese guy walks over to the window to look across the garden into his sister's window to check on her. He lifts the blind and peers out for a fraction of a second before jumping back screaming and looking at my brother like he just saw something horrible. My brother then goes to look and he stops him. He tells him that he saw a dark cloud with red eyes hovering over his sister's sleeping body. My brother, naturally, doesn't believe him and decides to look for himself. He creeps quietly over to the window and lifts the blind, but this time, he finds himself eye to eye with what he describes as a dark black puff of smoke with the face. My brother and this other guy admit that they got under the covers and stayed there until it was light outside, too afraid to lift the blankets and see that the smoky figure had come a little closer and was in the room with them, just on the other side of the thin sheets. I don't know what to believe. Or maybe they drank more than what they said they did that night and imagined it all. But I know my brother believes what he saw. He sticks to his story, and when he tells it, he looks like someone who saw something truly sinister. There was a thread on the main page asking cops if they have ever experienced anything creepy or odd at a crime scene. I posted the following story, and some people said I should submit it over here. I'm new here, so be gentle. This is the entire post, but the second story is the one that got the most attention. I've seen a lot of suicides, but one sticks out. This elderly female had her adult daughter living with her. She called us because she hadn't seen her daughter for 2 days and hadn't heard her moving around upstairs. The stairway going up was very narrow, and at the top was a direct 90-degree turn into the bedroom. The mother was too elderly to climb the stairs, so she called us. We get there and enter the bedroom and find the daughter dead. She hung herself by tying the rope from her robe around her neck and the other end to the bedpost. Then she just laid on the floor and let her weight compress the rope. Seemed odd because she could have easily just sat up or lifted herself up to keep from being strangled. Almost wouldn't thought her body would have done it on its own as a defense mechanism. Anyway, we untie her and check vitals, but she's gone. We need to check the body for signs of trauma, so we do that. As we're turning her over, the air escapes from her lungs and she goes, "Ah." and I feel the air blow over my arm. It grossed me out big time. Anyway, we couldn't get her out of the room because the stairway was too narrow. Ambulance arrives and we strap her to a backboard and lower her out the window and down the ladder of the fire truck. I felt terrible for the mother because she was in hysterics and her daughter being tossed out the upstairs window with the whole neighborhood watching. I never found out any details about her body afterwards, so I don't know if she took pills and then laid down and passed out, etc., but that method of suicide struck me as very odd. Next, got an alarm call to a home where someone had committed suicide the year before. The house was still owned by the family, but it sat unused. No one lived there. Another officer and I clear the house and advise dispatch that everything is kosher. No forced entry anywhere, but the back door was unlocked. We contacted the owner and he told us he leaves it unlocked. Whatever. Anyway, we're in the house just looking around, remarking how it's a shame that the house just sits there unused. The other officer goes to take a leak and I'm standing there in the living room when I hear footsteps upstairs. Now, we check the entire upstairs. Each room, every closet, bathroom, etc. My partner yells from the bathroom, "Are those footsteps?" He comes out zipping up and we rush upstairs. Nothing. Doors to the rooms are open. We check each room again. Each closet, everywhere. The upstairs is flat out empty. There wasn't even furniture left in the house. He's in one room and I'm in another when I feel this coldness enter the room. It was just a cold that felt like it encompassed my entire body. Then it was as if someone in front of me shoved me with both hands. It was a very distinct feeling of two hands shoving me backwards by pushing my chest. I'm a cop. Normally someone shoves you and it's game on. But this time there was no one there. Just an empty room. I must have sat there with a stupid look on my face for maybe a second or two. Then I left the room completely creeped out. I met my buddy in the hallway and he tells me I look weird. I tell him what happened and he says, "Yeah, this place is fucking creepy. Let's bounce." It was daytime, and the house was fully lit as there were no curtains or shades on any of the windows. Later, I told my supervisor about it, and he said he went to an alarm call there as well, and as soon as he went inside, he got that creepy feeling where it feels like you're being watched. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe and click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/LetsReadOfficial, and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And join my Discord to interact with me and other listeners directly. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, always kiss your homies. Good night.